Mother Bear adopted this lost baby in the forest. Then something shocking happened. Let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you're new to our channel. The dawn mist curled around ancient pine trunks like ghostly fingers as the forest awakened to a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the familiar call of a chickadee or the rustle of deer through undergrowth, but something altogether foreign to these woods, the high-pitched, desperate cry of a human baby. The unusual sound traveled through the morning air, disturbing the natural rhythm of the wilderness that stretched for miles beyond the small village of Elderbrook. Nestled in a hollow between two moss-covered boulders lay a small bundle, wrapped in a faded blue blanket adorned with tiny embroidered stars. The infant, just 7 months old with wisps of dark hair and tear-stained cheeks, wailed with increasing desperation as the morning grew brighter. His name was Theo, though no one in these woods knew that. Only his parents, Lena and Micah, who had been traveling through the forest when their wagon wheel broke on the uneven path. They had placed their son safely aside while attempting repairs when a sudden mountain lion attack scattered their horses, pulling the wagon and Lena with it. Micah had chased after, certain his son was secure in his makeshift bed. But the infant had rolled, bit by bit, down a gentle slope and now lay alone, hungry and afraid as creatures of the forest began to take notice. The first to approach was a fox, its russet coat shimmering in the dappled light. It circled cautiously, nose twitching at the unfamiliar scent before darting away at a louder, more fearsome sound coming from behind a thicket of blackberry bushes. The undergrowth parted with a crackling of twigs and fallen leaves as Ursa emerged, a massive brown bear with a scar across her muzzle and eyes that held unexpected intelligence. Ursa approached slowly, her powerful body moving with surprising grace for a creature of her size. She had been drawn by the strange cries, so unlike the natural sounds of her domain. Her fur, thick and shaggy from the spring melt, still carried bits of twigs and pine needles from her morning foraging. She towered over the tiny human, her breath warm and smelling of berries as she lowered her tremendous head to investigate. The baby's cries faltered momentarily as tiny blue eyes focused on the enormous creature above. A heartbeat of silence passed between them, primal fear somehow giving way to innocent curiosity. Then something extraordinary happened. Instead of a swipe of claws or baring of teeth, Ursa made a soft rumbling sound deep in her throat. She nudged the bundle gently with her nose, inhaling the baby's scent deeply, her eyes widening with what could only be described as recognition. Ursa had lost her 2 cubs the previous winter to a particularly harsh storm. The forest had whispered of her grief for months, how she had carried their small bodies for days before finally laying them to rest beneath a towering pine. And now, as she gazed at this helpless human infant, something ancient and maternal stirred within her wild heart. With unexpected gentleness, she maneuvered her massive jaws around the edge of the blanket, lifting the entire bundle with the delicacy of a mother moving her newborn cub. The baby's cries softened to whimpers as Ursa turned, carrying Theo deeper into the emerald shadows of the primeval forest, leaving nothing behind but tiny indentations in the earth and a single blue thread caught on a bramble. High above, a raven watched the unusual procession, its obsidian eyes reflecting the strange sight of a bear carrying a human child with tender care. It spread its wings and soared toward the village of Elderbrook, where frantic parents and villagers were already gathering with torches and weapons, preparing to search for a missing child, unaware of the extraordinary bond forming between 2 grieving souls deep in the heart of the ancient woods. As Ursa carried Theo deeper into her territory, the baby's fear gradually subsided. Perhaps it was the rhythmic swaying as she walked, or the warmth of her breath through the blanket. but the infant's cries transformed into curious coos. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, witnessing this unprecedented moment, a creature of claw and fang choosing compassion over instinct. Squirrels paused on branches, deer froze mid-step, and even the wind seemed to quiet as Ursa navigated fallen logs and bubbling streams with her precious cargo. By midday, they reached her den, a spacious hollow beneath the exposed roots of an enormous oak that had partially uprooted during a storm decades ago. The entrance was hidden behind a curtain of trailing vines, and the interior was surprisingly warm and dry, lined with soft moss, feathers, and fragments of her own shed fur that she had meticulously arranged. It smelled of earth and pine, and the faint musk of bear, a scent that would soon become as familiar to Theo as his mother's perfume had once been. The den expanded deeper than it first appeared, with several chambers naturally formed by the twisting roots and hollowed earth. The main sleeping area where Ursa had placed Theo was the warmest, positioned away from the entrance to protect against drafts and potential threats. Shafts of light penetrated through small gaps in the root system above, creating an ethereal quality to the space that shifted as clouds passed overhead. In one corner lay a collection of objects Ursa had gathered over the years. Colorful stones from the riverbed, a tattered piece of red fabric likely dropped by hunters, and sadly, a small pile of twigs and leaves that had once been her cub's play area. She had never disturbed it, preserving this small monument to her lost children. Ursa placed the bundle gently on her sleeping platform and carefully unwrapped the blanket with her claws, revealing the tiny human in his simple cotton garment. Theo gazed up at her, his earlier terror replaced with the simple trust that only infants can muster. His tiny hand reached upward, grasping at the air between them, fingers opening and closing in that universal gesture of baby curiosity. The massive bear lowered her head closer, allowing the baby's fingers to brush against her muzzle. Her warm breath ruffled his dark hair as she inhaled his scent deeply, memorizing it as she would a cub of her own. Theo made a soft cooing sound and grabbed at her fur, his small fingers disappearing into her thick coat. Ursa rumbled quietly, a sound she had not made since her cub's passing, a mother's call, gentle and reassuring. As Theo's stomach growled audibly, Ursa recognized the sound of hunger. She moved to another chamber of her den where she kept her food stores, wild berries gathered that morning, honeycomb carefully stolen from a beehive, and the remains of a fish caught from the stream. With delicate precision that seemed impossible for her massive paws, she mashed some berries against a smooth stone, creating a sweet pulp. She returned to Theo and, using her tongue, carefully transferred small amounts of the berry mixture to his eager mouth. The baby ate hungrily, berry juice staining his lips purple as he swallowed the unexpected meal. His eyes grew heavy after feeding, the exhaustion of his ordeal finally catching up to him. Ursa watched as Theo's eyelids fluttered and closed, his breathing becoming deep and regular. She gently covered him with a portion of her own bedding, the softest moss and feathers she had collected, then curled her massive body around his tiny form, providing warmth and protection as he slept. And in that moment, as sunlight filtered through the root ceiling in dusty golden beams, illuminating this impossible tableau, a bond formed that defied nature itself. A connection born of shared loss and unexpected hope, setting the stage for events that would forever change both human and animal hearts in the ancient forest surrounding Elderbrook Village. Back in the village of Elderbrook, chaos had erupted. Lena and Micah had finally made their way back to the settlement after the terrifying mountain lion attack. Lena's arm was wrapped in bloodied bandages, her face ashen with pain and fear as she burst into the village square, her husband supporting her weight. "Our son!" she cried, her voice breaking with desperation. "Our baby is still in the forest." The villagers gathered quickly, faces grim with concern. Elderbrook was a small community of barely 200 souls, nestled between the ancient forest and rolling farmland. They were people of both worlds, farmers and hunters, respectful of the wilderness that provided their livelihood, but well aware of its dangers. Elder Thora, a silver-haired woman whose knowledge of the forest was unmatched in the village, stepped forward. Despite her 70 years, she stood straight as a pine, her weather-beaten face showing both compassion and determination. "Where exactly were you when you were separated from the child?" she asked, her voice calm but urgent. Micah, his usually strong shoulders now slumped with guilt, described the location as best he could. "Near the lightning-struck oak, where the path narrows by the 3 boulders," he explained, his voice hollow. "We laid Theo down while fixing our wagon wheel. The mountain lion came so suddenly. The horses bolted with the wagon. Lena was caught in the reins." His words faltered as he relived the horror of those moments. "I should never have chased after," he added, a sob catching in his throat. "I thought Theo was safe, tucked away from the path. I thought I would be gone only moments." Elder Thora nodded grimly. The 3 Boulder Pass is known territory for Kova's pride. Kova was what the villagers called the aging mountain lion that ruled the eastern forest. But there are other dangers in those woods beyond lions. The blacksmith's son, Rowan, a broad-shouldered young man of 20, already had his hunting bow in hand. "We must organize search parties immediately," he declared. "A baby cannot survive alone in the forest." "Not with night approaching," agreed Hunter Elias, the village's most experienced tracker. His face was deeply lined from years under the sun, each wrinkle mapping a lifetime of forest journeys. "And not with the bears growing more active after their winter sleep." At the mention of bears, Lena collapsed into renewed sobs against her husband's chest. Everyone knew that spring was when mother bears emerged with new cubs, making them particularly territorial and dangerous. "We'll split into 4 groups," Elder Thora decided, taking natural command of the situation. "Elias will lead the eastern approach, Rowan the western. Mari and her hunters will take the northern path, and I will guide the southern team myself." Mari, a fierce-eyed woman who had once killed a wolf with nothing but a hunting knife, nodded solemnly. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight braid, and her hand rested on the hilt of that same legendary knife. "We should bring the hounds," she suggested. "They might pick up the baby's scent." As the villagers scattered to prepare, gathering torches, weapons, and supplies, Elder Thora remained in the square with Lena and Micah. The old woman's eyes, still sharp as a hawk's despite her years, studied the couple carefully. "There is something you should know," she said in a lower voice once the others had gone. "The forest has been different these past months." "Different?" Micah asked, his arm still protectively around his wife. "How?" Elder Thora's weathered hand moved to a pendant around her neck, a polished bear claw set in silver, a symbol of her connection to the forest spirits according to village tradition. "The great brown bear that roams the western ridges lost her cubs this winter," she explained. "There was a terrible storm, and when it cleared, the woodland creatures spread word of her grief. She carried her dead for days, mourning as deeply as any human mother might." Lena looked up, confusion momentarily overtaking her despair. What does this have to do with finding Theo? The elder's eyes seemed to look beyond the village, into the deepening shadows of the forest. "Perhaps nothing," she admitted, "but the animals have been behaving strangely around her territory since then. The hunters report seeing deer and wolves drinking from the same stream when she is near, as if her grief has cast some spell over natural enemies. You speak as if this bear has magic, Micah said skeptically, though his voice held no judgment. Elder Thora's woodland wisdom had saved the village many times over the decades. Not magic, Thora corrected gently. Something older. Something about mothers and loss that transcends the boundaries between human and beast. She squeezed Lena's hand. If your son has wandered into her territory, it may not be the disaster we fear. Before either parent could question her further, the search parties began to assemble at the village edge, torches flickering to life as the afternoon sun slipped behind the western mountains. The forest, already darkening with evening shadows, seemed to loom larger and more threatening than ever before. Go with Elias, Elder Thora instructed the parents. His path will take you closest to where you last saw your child. I will follow the southern stream. There is something there I must see for myself. As the search parties dispersed into the wilderness, the old woman whispered a prayer to the forest spirits, her fingers clutching the bear claw pendant. If what she suspected was true, this night would test the boundaries between the human world and the wild in ways not seen for generations. Deep in her den, Ursa's ears pricked forward at the distant sound of human voices calling through the forest. Even from miles away, her sensitive hearing could detect their approach, the unfamiliar names they shouted echoing among the trees. One name in particular was repeated most often. Theo, the sound stirring the sleeping infant beside her. Theo awoke with a whimper, his tiny face scrunching as his empty stomach protested once more. The bear again prepared food for him, this time mashing the soft flesh of a fish with berries to create a more substantial meal. As she fed him, Ursa remained alert, her powerful body tense with indecision. The human searchers were still distant, but drawing closer with each passing hour. Part of her, the wild, instinctual part, urged her to move deeper into the forest, away from human intrusion. Yet another part, the grieving mother who had found unexpected solace in this small creature's presence, hesitated. In the few short hours since finding Theo, something profound had awakened within her, a purpose that had been absent since the storm took her cubs. Theo reached up again, his fingers finding the scar across her muzzle, a mark left by a poacher's trap years ago. The touch was so gentle, so trusting, that Ursa felt a rumble of contentment rise in her chest. She licked the baby's face clean of berry juice, her rough tongue causing him to giggle, a sound so pure and joyful that even the ancient trees seemed to lean closer to hear it. Outside the den, the forest had grown unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. The usual evening chorus of insects and frogs fell silent, and even the wind seemed to still. Something extraordinary was unfolding in these woods, something that hadn't occurred in living memory, and every creature, from the smallest beetle to the wisest old owl, sensed the shift in the natural order. As darkness fully enveloped the forest, Ursa made her decision. She would not flee with the human child, nor would she hide him away from his kind. But neither would she simply abandon him to fate. She would protect him until the right moment presented itself, until she could ensure his safe return. For though she was a creature of instinct and survival, Ursa had somehow grasped a truth that transcended species. Sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected sources, and healing could begin in the most unlikely connections. With this resolution firm in her heart, the great bear curled more protectively around the note-sleeping infant, her massive body forming an impenetrable fortress of fur and muscle. Her eyes, reflecting the faint moonlight that filtered into the den, remained fixed on the entrance, watchful and determined. Let the humans come with their torches and weapons. They would find not a monster, but a guardian. Not a threat, but a miracle. And deep in the forest, as if sensing the bear's decision, Elder Thora paused in her search, her hand going to the bear claw pendant at her throat. It had grown unexpectedly warm against her skin, a sign she had not felt since her own youth in these woods. "Guide us," she whispered to the darkness, "to where boundaries dissolve and old wisdom prevails." Behind her, the search party's torches bobbed like fireflies against the night, unaware that they were walking toward a moment that would become legend in Elderbrook for generations to come. Dawn broke over the forest with fingers of golden light stretching through the canopy. The search parties had continued through the night, their voices growing hoarse from calling Theo's name, their hopes diminishing with each passing hour. Lena had refused to rest despite her injuries, pushing forward with the desperate energy that only a mother searching for her child could summon. Micah walked beside her, his eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness and silent tears. "We should have found some sign by now," Hunter Elias murmured to Elder Thora as their paths crossed near a small clearing. "No tracks, no cloth fragments, nothing. It's as if the earth swallowed the child." Elder Thora's eyes narrowed as she studied the forest around them. The birds were singing their morning songs, but there was something different in their calls, a message she could almost understand after decades of forest living. "We're looking in the wrong places," she said suddenly. "We need to go west, toward the ancient oak." "The bear's territory?" Elias looked skeptical. "If the child wandered there, then there's all the more reason to search it," Thora interrupted firmly. "Gather the others. We head west before the sun climbs higher." Meanwhile, in her den beneath the ancient oak, Ursa was facing a dilemma. Theo had awakened hungry and fussy, his small face reddening as he cried for nourishment that berries and fish alone couldn't provide. The bear paced anxiously, torn between her growing attachment to the infant and the knowledge that he needed care she could not give. Suddenly, she stiffened. Her keen nose had caught a familiar scent on the morning breeze. Humans, closer now than before. Among them was a scent that made her hesitate, one she had not encountered in many seasons. The distinctive woodland herbs and bear claw pendant of Elder Thora. Years ago, when Ursa was barely more than a cub herself, she had been caught in a poacher's trap. A cruel metal device that had clamped around her muzzle, leaving the scar she still carried. It was Thora, younger then but already respected for her wisdom, who had found her. Instead of calling hunters, the woman had carefully released the trap and treated Ursa's wound with forest herbs, speaking in soft tones that somehow reached beyond the bear's pain and fear. "Go free, little one," Thora had whispered then. "Perhaps one day our paths will cross in peace again." Ursa had never forgotten that voice or that mercy, and now, that same human approached as Theo's cries grew more insistent, the bear made her decision. Gently picking up the infant by his blanket once more, she carried him toward the entrance of her den. The time had come to bridge two worlds. Outside, the forest had fallen strangely silent again, the morning birds quieting as if in anticipation. Ursa emerged from her den into the dappled sunlight, the baby held carefully in her jaws. She moved with deliberate slowness to a small clearing before the ancient oak, a place where she would be visible, but where she also had clear paths of retreat if necessary. There, she set Theo down on a bed of soft moss and stood protectively beside him, waiting. It was Mari who spotted them first, her hunter's eyes catching the movement between trees. She froze, her hand instinctively moving to her knife before the full scene registered in her mind. A massive brown bear standing over a small bundle that emitted a sound unmistakably human. The sight was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she knew of bears, that Mari found herself momentarily unable to move or call out. Then Elder Thora stepped forward, having followed Mari's gaze. The old woman's breath caught as understanding dawned on her weathered face. "It's her," she whispered, her hand going to the bear claw pendant, "and she has the child." Lena heard those words and pushed past the others, heedless of the danger. "Theo," she cried, her mother's heart recognizing her child's cries even at a distance. Micah lunged after her, trying to hold her back from running straight toward the bear. "Wait!" Elder Thora's command stopped them all. "Look closely before you act." The search party stood in stunned silence as the scene before them came into focus. The bear, larger than any they had ever hunted, was not mauling or threatening the child. Instead, she stood in a protective stance, her massive body positioned between the baby and what she perceived as potential danger. But most astonishing of all, when Theo's cries intensified, the bear turned and gently nudged him with her nose, making that same soft rumbling sound that had comforted him through the night. "She's protecting him," Rowan said in disbelief, lowering his bow slightly. Elder Thora stepped forward slowly, her hands empty and visible. "I know you," she called softly to the bear. "We have met before, many seasons ago. You remember kindness. As I see now, you have shown kindness." Ursa's dark eyes fixed on the old woman, recognition flickering in their depths. She made no aggressive move but remained firmly beside Theo. "The child needs his mother," Thora continued, gesturing for Lena to step forward. "As you once needed help, he needs his own kind now." Lena moved forward with trembling steps, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered. The word meant for both Thora and the bear. "He's my baby." Something in the mother's voice, the same desperate love that Ursa herself had felt for her lost cubs, seemed to reach the bear. She looked down at Theo, then back at the approaching woman. For a long moment, the forest held its breath as two mothers, one human, one bear, regarded each other across a divide of species but united by a common bond. Then, with deliberate gentleness, Ursa stepped back from Theo, creating a small space between herself and the infant. It was not a complete withdrawal, but a tentative invitation. "Go slowly," Elder Thora advised Lena. "No sudden movements." Step by careful step, Lena approached, her eyes never leaving her child. When she was close enough to see Theo's face clearly, berry-stained but unharmed, a sob of relief escaped her. 3 more steps and she was close enough to reach down and gather her son into her arms, clutching him to her chest as tears flowed freely. "Thank you," she whispered, looking directly at the bear. "Thank you for keeping him safe." Ursa watched this reunion with what could only be described as mournful understanding. Her massive head lowered slightly, and a soft sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whimper, escaped her. It was the sound of recognition, of a mother seeing another mother's joy and feeling both satisfaction and the renewed ache of her own loss. Elder Thora alone seemed to understand what passed between them. She approached the bear with the same calm confidence she had shown years ago when freeing her from the trap. "You have done what few of your kind or ours would do," she said softly. "You have bridged the divide between wild and human hearts." The bear's eyes, intelligent and somehow sorrowful, met the old woman's. In that moment, something passed between them. An understanding beyond words, a recognition of shared wisdom. "Your cubs were taken too soon," Thora continued in a voice only Ursa could hear. but in saving this child you have honored their memory in the most beautiful way." Behind them, the rest of the search party watched in awe as Lena backed slowly away with Theo, returning to Micah's protective embrace. The baby had quieted in his mother's arms, his small head turning to look back at the bear who had been his unlikely guardian. Ursa remained motionless, watching as the humans slowly began to retreat. There was no triumph in their postures, no celebration of having rescued a child from a beast, only a quiet reverence for what they had witnessed. Even Rowan and the other hunters lowered their weapons completely, recognizing that they stood in the presence of something sacred. As the group prepared to return to the village, Elder Thora lingered a moment longer with the bear. From around her neck, she removed the bear claw pendant she had worn for decades and placed it gently on the ground before Ursa. "So the forest will remember," she said simply, "and so will our people." With that, she turned to follow the others, leaving Ursa standing alone in the clearing. The bear watched until the last human disappeared among the trees, then lowered her nose to sniff at the pendant. It carried Thora's scent and something more, a promise that this moment would not be forgotten, that the boundary crossed would remain open. As the morning sun climbed higher, Ursa returned to her den beneath the ancient oak. It felt emptier now without Theo's small presence, the silence more profound. Yet, as she settled into her moss bed, still carrying the baby's scent, something had changed within her. The grief that had consumed her since losing her cubs had transformed into something else. Not gone, but different. In saving another mother's child, she had found a way to honor her own. And in the village of Elderbrook, as the search party returned with Theo safe in his mother's arms, a new story was already taking shape. A story that would be told for generations about the mother bear who adopted a lost baby in the forest, and, in doing so, taught humans and animals alike about the transcendent power of compassion. Word of the miracle spread rapidly through Elderbrook and beyond. Within days, villagers from neighboring settlements arrived to hear the tale firsthand, of how Ursa, the great brown bear of the western ridges, had saved and protected a human child when she could have easily taken his life. The story grew with each telling, some claiming the bear had fought off wolves to defend Theo, others insisting she had deliberately sought human help when she realized the baby needed his mother. Elder Thora neither confirmed nor denied these embellishments. The truth, she knew, was remarkable enough without exaggeration. She had been there, had witnessed the understanding in Ursa's eyes, had felt the sacred connection between mother bear and human child. That was the heart of the story, not theatrics, but the simple, profound choice of compassion over instinct. For Lena and Micah, the aftermath brought a mixture of gratitude and guilt. Their son had been returned to them unharmed. In fact, Theo seemed unusually content after his forest adventure, often looking toward the western trees as if remembering something important. But the knowledge that they had nearly lost him, that their carelessness had put him in such danger, weighed heavily on their hearts. 1 week after Theo's rescue, Lena approached Elder Thora's cottage at the village edge. The old woman was grinding herbs in a stone mortar, the scent of forest medicine filling the air. She looked up as Lena entered, not surprised by the visit. "You have questions," Thora said simply, setting aside her work. Lena nodded, settling on a wooden stool. Theo slept peacefully in a sling across her chest, his small face relaxed in dreams. "I can't stop thinking about her. The bear," she admitted. "About what she did for my son when she had every reason to harm him." Elder Thora studied the younger woman thoughtfully. "Nature is not always what we believe it to be," she said. "We humans draw firm lines between ourselves and the wild, forgetting that we too are animals beneath our village ways. But a bear caring for a human child? It defies everything we know, Lena insisted. Does it? Thora picked up a sprig of fresh mint, crushing it between her fingers to release its sharp, clean scent. Or does it simply remind us of what we've forgotten? That motherhood, the drive to protect the small and vulnerable, runs deeper than the divisions between species. Lena's hand moved unconsciously to stroke Theo's dark hair. She lost her cubs, she said softly. It wasn't a question. In the great winter storm, Thora confirmed, I found their burial place. Yes, burial, for she covered them with stones and branches as carefully as we cover our dead. She mourned them as deeply as you would have mourned Theo had she not intervened. Tears filled Lena's eyes. I need to thank her properly, she whispered. Not just words spoken in the moment of reunion, but something meaningful. Elder Thora's weathered face softened. I believe I know a way, she said, but it will require courage and trust, and the help of the entire village. 2 days later, as dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, a strange procession made its way from Elderbrook toward the ancient oak. Leading the way was Elder Thora, wearing ceremonial garments adorned with symbols of the forest, bear paws, owl feathers, and river stones. Behind her walked Lena and Micah, with Theo alert and wide-eyed in his mother's arms. Following them came nearly every villager, each carrying something in their hands, baskets of berries, fresh fish wrapped in cool leaves, honeycomb carefully harvested from the village hives. They moved in silence through the forest, respecting the sanctity of what they were about to do. Even the children understood the importance of quiet, their usual chatter subdued to whispers as they helped carry the smaller offerings. When they reached the clearing before the ancient oak, Elder Thora raised her hand for the procession to halt. Place the offerings here, she instructed, indicating a flat stone that caught the morning sunlight. Then move back to the edge of the clearing. Remember, no sudden movements, no loud noises. We are guests in her domain. One by one, the villagers came forward, setting down their gifts, the freshest and finest foods they could gather, a bounty that acknowledged their debt to the forest guardian. When all had been arranged, Elder Thora stepped forward once more, the bear claw pendant, retrieved from where she had left it, and now secured on a new cord of woven grass, held in her outstretched hands. Ursa of the ancient oak, she called, her voice carrying through the morning air. Mother who saved one not her own. We come in peace, in gratitude, in recognition. For long moments nothing happened. The forest remained still, save for the gentle stirring of leaves in the morning breeze. Some of the younger children grew restless, shifting from foot to foot, while a few adults exchanged skeptical glances. Perhaps the bear had moved on, or perhaps she wanted nothing more to do with humans after returning the child. Then a twig snapped, and all eyes turned toward the massive roots of the ancient oak. Ursa emerged slowly, her powerful form even more impressive in the full light of day. Many of the villagers gasped or stepped back involuntarily. Few had been present at Theo's rescue, and most had never been this close to such a formidable predator without weapons between them. The bear paused, her nose testing the air, her intelligent eyes scanning the gathering. When she spotted Elder Thora, there was visible recognition in her posture. But when her gaze found Lena and the baby, something else passed across her ursine features, a softening, an acknowledgement. Theo, upon seeing the bear, let out a delighted sound and reached his small arms toward her, startling everyone, including his mother. It was as if he remembered her, recognized his protector. She won't harm him, Elder Thora said with quiet confidence as Lena instinctively clutched Theo closer. She could have done so a dozen times over when he was in her care. Trust what you know to be true. Gathering her courage, Lena stepped forward with Micah close behind her. They stopped several paces from Ursa, close enough to be seen clearly, but maintaining a respectful distance. "We've brought you gifts," Lena said, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger as she continued, "to thank you for saving our son when we could not. The village will honor you always as Theo's second mother, his guardian from the forest." At these words, Ursa's attention seemed to sharpen. She moved forward with surprising grace for her size, approaching the stone where the offerings had been placed. The villagers watched in breathless silence as she sniffed at the bounty. Berries, fish, honey, all things she would normally forage for herself, but freely given now as tribute. What happened next would be debated in Elderbrook for years to come. Some would insist it was simply animal behavior, coincidental rather than meaningful. Others would swear it was as deliberate as any human gesture of ceremony. Ursa selected a single berry from the pile, one perfect blackberry, and with careful delicacy that belied her massive jaws, she approached Lena and Theo. The mother stood her ground, though her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. The bear stopped just short of them and placed the berry on the ground at their feet. Elder Thora's breath caught audibly. "A gift returned," she whispered, "an exchange between mothers." With trembling fingers, Lena reached down and picked up the berry. Understanding instinctively what was expected, she helped Theo take it in his tiny hand and then guided it to his mouth. The baby ate the offering happily, berry juice staining his lips just as it had during his time in the bear's den. A collective sigh seemed to pass through the gathered villagers. Something profound had transpired, a covenant of sorts between human and bear, between village and forest. Elder Thora stepped forward again and hung the bear claw pendant on a low branch of the ancient oak. "This will mark this place as sacred ground," she declared, her voice carrying to all present. "From this day forward, no hunter from Elderbrook will ever raise a weapon against Ursa or her kin. This boundary of the western ridge shall be respected as her domain, undisturbed by human hands." The villagers murmured their agreement, many nodding solemnly. Even Rowan and the other hunters bowed their heads in acceptance of this new law. The protection of the bear, who had protected one of their own, seemed not just fair, but necessary. A balancing of debts between species. Ursa watched this ceremony with that same intelligent gaze that had so struck Elder Thora years ago. When the pendant was hung and the declaration made, she made a soft huffing sound and backed away several paces, not in fear, but in acknowledgement that the exchange was complete. As the villagers began to quietly depart, Lena lingered a moment longer. "Will she be all right?" she asked Elder Thora softly. "Alone, after losing her cubs, after caring for Theo, will she heal?" The old woman gazed thoughtfully at the bear, who had not yet returned to her den, but watched the humans from the edge of the clearing. "Loss never fully leaves us," she said wisely. "But sometimes in helping others we find a way to carry it more gently. I believe she has found that way." Seasons turned, as they always do in the forest. Summer warmed to its height, bringing abundance of berries and fish. Autumn painted the trees in fiery colors before winter once again wrapped the land in its cold embrace. Through it all, the villagers of Elderbrook honored their promise. No hunter ventured into Ursa's territory, and the ancient oak became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Villagers would occasionally leave small offerings of food, not out of fear, but respect. Theo grew from infant to toddler, his dark hair now forming unruly curls around a face that showed unusual thoughtfulness for a child his age. He spoke earlier than most children, but his first word was neither mama nor dada, as his parents expected. Instead, to their astonishment, his first clear utterance was "bear," spoken while pointing toward the western forest. By his third birthday, Theo had developed habits that set him apart from other village children. He would often sit perfectly still, watching forest animals with a patience uncommon in one so young. Birds would land near him without fear, and even the skittish deer that grazed at the village edge seemed untroubled by his presence. Most striking of all was his lack of fear toward wild things. Where other children might shriek at a spider or run from a snake, Theo would observe with quiet fascination. "He carries the forest in him now," Elder Thora explained to Lena one spring morning as they watched the boy carefully examining a line of ants near the cottage door. His time with Ursa may have been brief, but it marked him. Some part of him will always belong to the wild. Lena nodded, no longer troubled by her son's unusual connection to the forest. "Has there been any sign of her lately?" she asked. Each season she inquired after the bear, feeling a bond that transcended their brief encounter. "The forest whispers that she has taken a mate," Thora replied with a small smile. "The rangers spotted tracks of cubs this spring, 2 of them following their mother along the western ridge." Joy and something like relief flooded Lena's heart. Ursa had found healing, had created new life after loss. The circle had continued, as it always did in nature's way. That evening, as Lena tucked Theo into bed, he looked up at her with those thoughtful eyes that seemed too wise for his years. "Tell me about Bear Mother again," he requested, as he did most nights. And so she told him the story once more, of how he had been lost in the forest, of how a grieving mother bear had found him and kept him safe, feeding him berries and fish until his human parents could find him again. She told him of the sacred bond formed that day, of the promise made by the village to honor and protect the bear who had protected him. "Will I see her again?" Theo asked, as he always did at the end of the story. "Perhaps," Lena answered honestly. "The forest holds many mysteries and many reunions. But remember, Theo, even if your eyes never behold her again, Bear Mother watches over you from the western ridge. Her protection travels with you always." Satisfied with this answer, as he always was, Theo drifted to sleep. But this night something unusual happened. As moonlight filtered through the cottage window, casting silver patterns across the sleeping child's face, a sound came from the forest edge. A soft huffing call that was neither threatening nor alarming, but somehow questioning. Lena, still awake by the hearth, felt the hairs rise on her arms. Without waking her husband or son, she moved to the cottage door and stepped outside into the cool spring night. The village was quiet, most homes dark as families slumbered. She turned toward the western trees and held her breath. There, just at the forest boundary, a massive silhouette stood in the moonlight. Ursa, unmistakable even at a distance, with 2 smaller forms tumbling playfully around her massive paws. The bear had brought her new cubs to the edge of the human world, as if to show them something important, as if completing a circle begun 3 years earlier. Lena raised her hand in silent greeting, tears welling in her eyes. For a long moment, human and bear regarded each other across the divide between their worlds. No longer strangers, not quite friends, but bound by something deeper than either could articulate. Then, with a final soft huff that carried on the night breeze, Ursa turned and melted back into the shadowed forest, her cubs following close behind. Lena remained outside for a long time afterward, watching the place where they had disappeared, her heart full of wordless gratitude. Inside the cottage, Theo smiled in his sleep, one small hand reaching outward as if to touch something only he could see in his dreams. The years passed, and the story of Theo and the mother bear became legend, not just in Elderbrook, but throughout the region. Travelers would detour to the village just to hear the tale from those who had witnessed it. Some came skeptical, believing it exaggerated or invented, but few left unconvinced. There was something in the way the villagers told it, a reverent consistency that spoke of truth, not fabrication. By his 10th birthday, Theo had grown into a slender, serious boy with an uncanny connection to the forest that bordered his home. While other village children his age were learning trades from their parents, blacksmithing, farming, weaving, Theo spent hours with Elder Thora, learning the ancient ways of forest wisdom that few in Elderbrook still practiced. "The boy has the gift," Thora told Lena and Micah when they expressed concern about their son's future. "He understands the language of birds and beasts in a way I've spent 7 decades learning. This is no ordinary talent. It is a blessing born from his unusual beginning." And indeed, Theo demonstrated abilities that even Elder Thora found remarkable. He could predict storms days before they arrived by observing subtle changes in animal behavior. He found healing herbs that even the old woman sometimes overlooked. Most impressively, he could approach the most skittish creatures without causing alarm. Deer would eat from his open palm, and hawks would perch on branches just above his head, regarding him with curious eyes rather than wary distance. On a crisp autumn day in Theo's 12th year, something happened that would further cement the bond between the boy and the wilderness that had once been his temporary home. He and Elder Thora were foraging for late-season mushrooms near the boundary of Ursa's territory, not crossing into the sacred ground, but skirting its edges with respectful caution. The forest seemed unusually quiet that morning, the typical chatter of squirrels and birdsong noticeably absent. Theo paused in his gathering, his head tilting slightly as if listening to something beyond human hearing. "Something's wrong," he said simply, turning toward the west. "The forest is afraid." Elder Thora had long since learned to trust the boy's instincts. "What do you feel?" she asked, setting down her basket of herbs. "Pain," Theo replied, his young face troubled. "Great pain from the ancient oak. We need to go there." The old woman hesitated. They had always honored the boundary established years ago, never entering Ursa's domain without ceremony or invitation. But the urgency in Theo's voice was compelling, and she too could sense an unusual tension in the forest around them. "We will go," she decided, but, with caution and respect, they moved deeper into the western forest, following game trails that wound between massive trees and moss-covered boulders. As they drew closer to the ancient oak, Theo's pace quickened, driven by something Elder Thora could sense only dimly, but the boy felt with growing clarity. The sound reached them before the sight, a low, pained growling that raised the hairs on both their necks. Not threatening, but suffering. They crested a small rise, and the ancient oak came into view in its clearing, its massive roots twisting into the earth as they had for centuries. But the scene before them was not peaceful. Ursa lay on her side near the entrance to her den, her massive body heaving with labored breaths. Around her, 3 half-grown cubs paced anxiously, occasionally nudging their mother with worried snouts. Even from a distance, the cause of the bear's distress was clear. A crude iron trap, similar to the one that had scarred her muzzle years ago, had clamped around her front paw. Blood darkened the fur of her leg, and the chain attached to the trap was caught around a tree root, preventing her escape. "Poachers," Elder Thora hissed, anger flashing in her usually gentle eyes. "They have violated our sacred boundary." But Theo was already moving forward, driven by an instinct deeper than fear or caution. The 3 cubs noticed his approach and growled warnings, positioning themselves protectively before their injured mother. Theo stopped, not in fear but in respect for their concern. "I won't hurt her," he said softly, speaking as much to the cubs as to Elder Thora. "I'm here to help." What happened next would be added to the growing legend of Theo and the bears. The boy knelt on the forest floor and began to hum, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to vibrate through the clearing. It was a melody Elder Thora had never taught him, something ancient and wordless that seemed to come from the forest itself. Ursa's eyes, clouded with pain, focused on the boy. Recognition flickered in their depths, not of a specific human face she had seen briefly years ago, but of something deeper, a scent, perhaps, or an essence that had imprinted on her during those hours when she had protected a human infant as her own. To Elder Thora's amazement, the massive bear made a soft huffing sound, and her cub's aggressive posture relaxed slightly. It wasn't complete acceptance, but it was permission. Guarded, cautious, but real. "Stay back," Theo instructed the old woman without turning around. "They're afraid for her, but they'll let me approach." Step by careful step, still humming that strange melody, the boy moved closer to the injured bear. The cubs watched warily but made no move to attack. When he was within arm's reach of Ursa, Theo finally fell silent, meeting the bear's gaze directly. "I remember you," he whispered, words meant only for her ears. "Not in thoughts or pictures, but in my heart. You kept me safe once, now I will help you." Elder Thora watched in awe as the boy, taught basic healing but never the dangerous work of trap removal, somehow knew exactly what to do. He examined the crude device without touching it, then reached into his foraging pouch for tools he always carried: a small knife, a length of strong cord, a vial of herbal salve. With methodical care that belied his youth, Theo worked to release the trap's pressure points while speaking continuously to Ursa in that same low, soothing tone. The bear remained unnaturally still, as if understanding that movement would make her rescue more difficult. Her cubs had settled nearby, their initial hostility replaced by cautious observation. It took nearly an hour of patient manipulation before the trap's jaws finally released their cruel grip. The moment the pressure eased, Ursa let out a sound, half roar, half sigh, that seemed to shake the very trees around them. But she made no move to rise, her injured paw mangled and bleeding freely now that the constriction was removed. Without hesitation, Theo applied the healing salve to the wound and wrapped it with strips torn from his own shirt. All the while, he spoke to Ursa as one might speak to an old friend, not in baby talk or as one addresses a pet, but with respect and connection that transcended the barriers between their species. When the makeshift bandage was secured, Theo finally stood and backed away several paces, rejoining Elder Thora at the edge of the clearing. The old woman placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling him trembling, not with fear, but with the intensity of what had passed between him and the great bear. "We need to find whoever did this," the boy said, his voice suddenly hard with an anger that seemed older than his years. "They can't be allowed to hunt here." Elder Thora nodded grimly. "The village will send trackers. No one from Elderbrook would dare set traps here, but outsiders might not know or respect our boundaries." As they prepared to leave, to bring news and gather help from the village, Ursa suddenly lifted her massive head. Her eyes, still bright with pain, but now also with something like determination, fixed on Theo. With agonizing effort, she pushed herself to a standing position, her injured paw held carefully above the ground, her weight distributed to the remaining three. The bear lumbered forward a few steps, her cubs moving anxiously around her. When she was just a few paces from Theo, she lowered her head until their eyes were level. For a breath-stopping moment, human boy and mother bear regarded each other with a connection that seemed to stretch across time. from that first miraculous encounter years ago to this moment of reciprocal rescue. Then, with gentle deliberation, Ursa touched her nose to Theo's forehead, a gesture so tender and purposeful that Elder Thora felt tears spring to her eyes. It was blessing, acknowledgement, gratitude, all without words but unmistakable in meaning. "The circle is complete," the old woman whispered. "She saved you, and now you have saved her." As they made their way back to the village to report the poacher's intrusion, Theo walked with a new purpose in his step. Something had shifted within him. A calling taking clearer shape, a destiny unfolding that had been set in motion the day a mother bear found a lost human child in the forest. The news of poachers in the sacred forest spread through Elderbrook like wildfire. Village council members gathered immediately in the town square, their faces grave with concern. This wasn't merely a violation of hunting grounds. It was sacrilege against the covenant they had formed with Ursa and the forest itself. "We must find who did this," declared Rowan, now head of the village hunters and a staunch protector of the bear sanctuary since that day 12 years ago, "and ensure they never return to our lands." Micah, who had become a respected voice in the village council, nodded in agreement. "My son risked himself to free Ursa from their trap. We owe it to both of them to ensure this never happens again." The council organized search parties to patrol the forest boundaries and find any sign of the intruders. Elder Thora, despite her advancing years, insisted on guiding one such group herself, with Theo at her side. His connection to the forest would be invaluable in tracking those who had violated their sacred trust. As preparations were being made, Lena approached her son. At 12, Theo already stood nearly as tall as her shoulder, his child's frame beginning to stretch toward the man he would become. But when she looked in his eyes, she still saw the infant who had been cradled in a bear's careful protection. "You could have been hurt today," she said softly, adjusting the new shirt he had changed into after sacrificing his old one for Ursa's bandage. Theo shook his head with certainty beyond his years. "She would never hurt me, Mother. Just as she didn't hurt me when I was a baby." "The cubs might have," Lena pointed out gently. "They recognized something in me," he replied simply, "the same way she did when she found me all those years ago." Lena touched her son's cheek, noting how his skin had tanned from countless hours in the forest sun. "What did you feel when you were healing her?" she asked, curious about the trance-like state Elder Thora had described. Theo was quiet for a moment, struggling to find words for what had been a mostly wordless experience. "It was like remembering something I never knew I'd forgotten," he finally said. "When I heard her in pain, it wasn't a stranger suffering. It was someone connected to me by something stronger than blood." His mother nodded, understanding despite the strangeness of it all. "Your life has been unusual from its very beginning," she said with a small smile. "Perhaps it will continue to be so." "I know what I'm meant to do now," Theo told her, his young voice suddenly firm with conviction. "Elder Thora has been teaching me forest wisdom, but today showed me why. I'm meant to be a bridge between our worlds, human and wild, to protect what lies between, what connects us." Lena felt tears spring to her eyes at the certainty in her son's voice. She had sometimes worried about his future, his unusual interests setting him apart from other village children. But now she saw the purpose in it, a calling as sacred and important as any in their community. "Then we will help you follow that path," she promised, embracing him. The search for the poachers lasted 3 days, with villagers combing the forest in carefully organized patterns. It was Theo who finally discovered their camp. a crude settlement of 3 men from beyond the northern mountains who had come seeking bear pelts and had no knowledge of, or regard for, local customs and boundaries. When confronted by the full hunting party from Elderbrook, led by Rowan and accompanied by Theo and Elder Thora, the poachers initially laughed at the notion that they had violated sacred ground. Their amusement died quickly when faced with 24 grim-faced villagers, armed and unified in their anger. "You have a choice," Rowan informed them coldly. "Leave these lands immediately, never to return, or face judgment from our village council for the harm you've caused." "Over a bear?" scoffed the leader of the poachers, a scarred man with eyes like chips of ice. "They're beasts, nothing more. Worth good coin for their pelts and claws in the northern markets." Before Rowan could respond, Theo stepped forward. Though just a boy amid grown hunters, something in his stance commanded attention. "That bear you injured is under the protection of Elderbrook," he said, his young voice steady and clear in the forest clearing. "She once saved a human child when she could have killed it, a child who had wandered into her territory helpless and alone." The poacher's expression shifted slightly. Skepticism mingled with a hint of unease. "That child was me," Theo continued, "and the bear you tried to kill is the reason I'm alive today." A heavy silence fell over the clearing. Even the forest itself seemed to still, as if listening to the confrontation that would determine its future safety. "These woods hold wonders your northern markets can never price," Elder Thora added, moving to stand beside Theo. "Leave now with your lives and the knowledge that some things in this world are worth more than coin." Perhaps it was the unified stance of the villagers, or the unnerving confidence of the boy who claimed to have been saved by a bear. Whatever the reason, the poachers chose to depart, escorted to the northern boundary of Elderbrook's lands, and warned never to return. As they watched the intruders disappear over the northern ridge, Rowan turned to Theo with newfound respect. "You spoke with the authority of someone 3 times your age," he remarked. "They felt it too. I could see it in their eyes." Theo shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I only spoke the truth." "Truth has power when spoken from the heart," Elder Thora said, her aged hand resting on the boy's shoulder, "especially when that heart bridges 2 worlds." On their return journey to the village, they took a detour to check on Ursa. They found her resting near the ancient oak, her injured paw still wrapped in Theo's makeshift bandage. The wound would take time to heal, but Elder Thora judged that infection had been prevented by the quick application of healing herbs. The 3 cubs, now more accustomed to the human visitors, watched from a respectful distance as Theo approached their mother. The largest of them, a female with a distinctive white patch on her chest, seemed particularly interested in the boy, following his movements with intelligent eyes so similar to Ursa's. "She'll need fresh bandages and more salve," Theo observed, kneeling beside the great bear, who acknowledged him with a gentle huff. "I'll come back tomorrow." "We'll come back," Elder Thora corrected with a smile. "Though soon enough, you may not need my guidance for such journeys." As they prepared to leave, the white-patched female cub took several cautious steps toward Theo, her nose working to catch his scent. When she was just a few paces away, she sat on her haunches and tilted her head, as if considering the strange human boy who smelled faintly of her mother and of the forest they shared. "She's curious about you," Elder Thora observed, "just as her mother once was about a human infant." Theo nodded, not moving toward the cub but not retreating either. "Maybe she'll be the next bridge," he said softly. "When Ursa is gone and I'm grown." The old woman's eyes crinkled with appreciation for the boy's understanding of life's cycles. "The forest remembers," she agreed, "and so do its children. both human and bear. Years passed, seasons flowing one into another like the forest stream that wound its way through Elderbrook's lands. Theo grew from boy to young man, his childhood fascination with the wilderness deepening into genuine expertise under Elder Thora's continued guidance. By his 18th year, he had become her formal apprentice, learning the ancient ways of forest healing and wisdom that few still practiced. The poachers never returned to Elderbrook's forests, but their brief intrusion had changed how the village protected its boundaries. Regular patrols now traversed the forest edges, not just hunting for game but watching for signs of unwelcome visitors. Theo often led these patrols, his intimate knowledge of the woodland making him an invaluable guide. Ursa had recovered fully from her trapped paw, though she now moved with a slight limp when the weather turned cold. Her cubs had grown nearly to her size, though they stayed in her territory, rather than venturing out to establish their own, as bears typically did. The white-patched female, whom Theo had named Lumi, had developed a particular tolerance for human presence, specifically for Theo's visits. On a crisp autumn morning in Theo's 20th year, as golden leaves spiraled down through shafts of sunlight, he made his way alone to the ancient oak. Elder Thora, now nearing her 90th season, had become too frail for regular forest journeys, though her mind remained as sharp as ever. She had given Theo a special task this day, to gather certain rare mushrooms that grew only near the oak's massive roots, needed for a healing tonic for the village's winter supplies. As he approached the familiar clearing, Theo sensed immediately that something was different. The forest held an unusual stillness, not the threatening quiet of danger, but the respectful hush of witness. He slowed his steps, listening with both ears and heart to what the woodland was telling him. Ursa lay before her den beneath the ancient oak, her massive body unusually still. Around her, her 3 grown cubs, no longer cubs at all, but magnificent bears in their prime, formed a protective circle. Lumi, largest of the 3, raised her head as Theo entered the clearing, her dark eyes meeting his with what seemed like relief. Understanding dawned on him with a sharp pang of sorrow. Ursa was dying. The great bear who had saved him as an infant, who had formed the living bridge between human and wilderness, had reached the end of her long life. At nearly 30 years of age, ancient for a wild bear, she had survived longer than most of her kind, protected by the village covenant and perhaps by something more mysterious than human intervention. Theo approached slowly, respect and grief mingling in his careful steps. The 3 younger bears parted to let him through, a gesture that would have astonished anyone else from the village. But to Theo it felt right, a continuation of the unusual bond that had defined his life. He knelt beside Ursa, gently placing his hand on her massive head. Her fur had grayed around the muzzle, and her breathing came in shallow, labored movements. Yet, when she opened her eyes at his touch, they still held that same intelligent awareness he had always seen in them. "I'm here," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "Old friend, second mother. I'm here with you." Ursa made a soft rumbling sound deep in her throat, weak but unmistakably a greeting. With visible effort, she lifted her scarred muzzle toward Theo's hand, breathing in his scent one final time. For hours, Theo sat beside the dying bear, sometimes speaking softly of village happenings, sometimes singing the low, humming melody he had used years ago when freeing her from the trap, but mostly just being present as her breathing grew more labored. The 3 younger bears maintained their vigil nearby, occasionally approaching to gently nuzzle their mother before retreating to give Theo his time with her. As the sun began to set, painting the clearing in hues of amber and gold, Ursa's breathing changed. Theo knew the moment had come. He placed both hands on her massive head and leaned forward until his forehead touched her fur, just as she had once touched her nose to his forehead in blessing years before. "Journey well, Ursa of the ancient oak," he whispered, tears flowing freely down his face. "Your courage and compassion will never be forgotten as long as Elderbrook stands and these forests thrive. I promise you this." With a final, gentle exhale, the great bear's spirit departed. A profound stillness settled over the clearing, broken only by Theo's quiet tears and the soft huffing sounds of grief from the three younger bears. As darkness began to fall, Theo knew what needed to be done. Years ago, Elder Thora had told him how Ursa had buried her own cubs beneath a massive pine after the winter storm took them. Now it was time to honor her in the same way. Through the night, working by moonlight and later by torch, Theo dug a grave at the base of the ancient oak, the very place where Ursa had sheltered him as an infant. The task was enormous for one man, but he was not alone for long. Near midnight, he heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see his father Micah, along with Rowan and several other village hunters. "Elder Thora sent us," Micah explained simply, taking up a shovel. "She said you would need help to honor the forest guardian." Together, they worked until dawn broke over the eastern hills, creating a resting place worthy of the great bear. As a first light touched the clearing, the three younger bears who had watched the humans' labor from a respectful distance approached the gravesite. In a moment that would be spoken of in Elderbrook for generations to come, humans and bears stood together in a circle around Ursa's body. Theo spoke words of gratitude and farewell, his voice steady despite his grief. When he finished, each villager placed something in the grave alongside the bear, a token of respect and remembrance. Micah laid down a carved wooden bear that had taken him years to perfect. Rowan added his finest arrowhead. Others contributed herbs, flowers, and personal treasures. Finally, Theo removed the bear claw pendant from around his neck, the very same one Elder Thora had once left at the ancient oak, which had since been passed to him as her apprentice. He placed it gently between Ursa's massive paws. "Full circle," he whispered. "From rescue to rest, your journey returns to where it began." As the first full rays of sunlight broke through the trees, illuminating the solemn gathering, Lumi, the white-patched bear who had shown such curiosity toward Theo years ago, stepped forward. In her jaws she carried a single perfect blackberry, which she delicately placed beside the pendant. Theo's breath caught at this echo of that day long ago when Ursa had offered a berry to his infant self, a gift between mothers. Now her daughter offered the same to honor her passing. The symmetry was so perfect, so profound, that for a moment the boundary between human and animal, between civilization and wilderness, seemed to dissolve completely. With reverent care, they covered Ursa's body with earth, creating a mound at the base of the ancient oak that would mark her resting place for years to come. When the work was complete, the villagers stepped back, leaving Theo alone with the three bears for a final moment of farewell. No words were spoken, but as Lumi met Theo's gaze across the fresh grave, something passed between them. An understanding, a promise, a continuation. The covenant between village and forest would not end with Ursa's passing. It would evolve, adapt, and endure through those who carried her legacy. As the villagers turned to leave, Theo lingered a moment longer. "Thank you," he whispered to the ancient tree, to the fresh earth, to the memory of the bear who had changed not just his life, but an entire village's relationship with the wilderness. For showing us all that compassion knows no boundaries. And as if in answer, a gentle breeze stirred the golden leaves of the ancient oak, sending them spiraling down like blessings upon the grave of a bear who had once adopted a lost baby in the forest, setting in motion a story of connection that would echo through generations of both humans and bears in the sacred woods of Elderbrook. Word of Ursa's passing spread beyond Elderbrook to neighboring villages and even to the larger towns beyond the mountain passes. For years, travelers had come to hear the legendary tale of the mother bear who had saved a human child. Now, they came to pay respects at her final resting place beneath the ancient oak. Elder Thora, too frail now to make the journey herself, instructed Theo on the proper rituals to welcome these pilgrims and share the true story rather than the exaggerated versions that had begun to circulate. Truth becomes legend so quickly, she told him one evening as they sat by her cottage hearth, her gnarled hands sorting dried herbs while he prepared medicines for the coming winter. Already I hear tales that claim Ursa fought off 12 wolves to protect you, or that she taught you to speak the language of bears. The simple truth that compassion crossed the boundary between species is miraculous enough without embellishment. Theo nodded, carefully grinding juniper berries with a stone mortar. At 21, he had grown into a lean, strong young man whose quiet presence commanded respect throughout the village. His dark hair, now worn long and tied back with a leather cord, still had the unruly curl from his childhood, and his eyes held a depth of wisdom unusual for his years. "I've been thinking," he said after a thoughtful silence, "about establishing a permanent boundary marker around Ursa's territory. Not just for hunters from our village who respect the covenant, but for strangers who might not know the significance of the ancient oak." Elder Thora's wrinkled face creased further with approval. "What do you envision?" "A circle of standing stones, perhaps," Theo explained, his hands pausing in their work as he described his idea. "Each carved with the bear paw symbol and placed along the perimeter of the sacred ground, visible enough to be noticed, enduring enough to last for generations. The village council will need to approve such an undertaking," Thora reminded him, "though I suspect they will support it readily. Your father's voice carries significant weight these days." It was true. Micah had become head of the council the previous spring, respected for his balanced judgment and unwavering support of the Forest Covenant. Lena, too, had found her place in village leadership, serving as chief artisan and teaching a new generation of weavers and woodworkers. "There's something else," Theo added, his voice dropping slightly as if sharing a sacred confidence. "Lumi and her siblings. They've begun to interact with me differently since Ursa's passing. Especially Lumi. She follows me sometimes when I gather herbs near the oak. Yesterday, she led me to a hidden berry patch I'd never found before." Elder Thora's eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with intelligence, studied him carefully. "The bond continues through her," she said softly. "I had hoped this might happen, but didn't dare predict it." "What does it mean?" Theo asked, though some part of him already sensed the answer. "It means," the old woman said, "that you are truly becoming what you were meant to be. Not just a forest healer like me, but something rarer. A bridge walker between worlds." She set aside her herbs and leaned forward, her voice gaining strength as she spoke of matters close to her heart. "In the oldest days, before villages grew and boundaries hardened, there were those who could speak to both human and animal spirits, who understood that wisdom flows through all living things, not just human minds. Like the stories you've told me of the ancient ones," Theo said, referring to the legends of Elderbrook's earliest settlers. "Yes," Thora nodded, "though many believe those are merely tales to entertain children. I have always known they contain deeper truths. And now, through you and Ursa and what grew between you, I see those old pathways reopening." In the following days, Theo presented his boundary marker proposal to the village council. As Elder Thora had predicted, they approved it enthusiastically, with many offering to help quarry and carve the stones. The project would take months to complete, but by the following summer, a circle of 12 standing stones, each carved with Ursa's paw print and symbols of protection, would surround the sacred territory of the ancient oak. As autumn deepened toward winter, Theo spent increasingly more time near Ursa's grave, often accompanied by Lumi, who had begun to treat the site as her own special territory. The white-patched bear, now fully grown and magnificent in her prime, would sometimes sit for hours near Theo as he gathered herbs or meditated beneath the great trees' spreading branches. On the first snow of the season, a gentle dusting that transformed the forest into a realm of crystalline beauty, something extraordinary happened. Theo had come to the oak with offerings of honey and dried berries to mark the changing of seasons, a practice Elder Thora had taught him. As he knelt by Ursa's grave, he became aware of Lumi approaching from behind, her massive paws making surprisingly little sound in the fresh snow. The bear stopped beside him, her breath forming clouds in the chill air. In her jaws, she carried something Theo couldn't immediately identify. With delicate precision that belied her enormous size, Lumi placed the object on the snow before him. A rabbit, freshly caught but completely intact, its neck broken cleanly in the way bears hunt. Theo understood immediately. This was not random. This was offering for offering, gift for gift. He had brought forest bounty to honor Lumi's mother. Now she brought forest bounty to share with him. "Thank you," he said softly, meeting the bear's intelligent gaze. "I accept your gift." That evening, as darkness fell early and snowflakes began to swirl more thickly from the darkening sky, Theo returned to Elder Thora's cottage with the rabbit and a heart full of wonder. The old woman listened to his account with shining eyes, her wizened face alight with the confirmation of her deepest hopes. "It begins," she said simply. "The true renewal of the covenant, not just remembered, but lived." Before spring arrived, Elder Thora passed peacefully in her sleep, a gentle transition for a woman who had lived nearly 90 years in harmony with the rhythms of the forest. The entire village mourned her passing, but none more deeply than Theo, who had lost not just a mentor, but a spiritual grandmother who had guided his unusual path from boyhood. On the day of her burial, as villagers gathered to lay her to rest near the eastern forest edge where the first wildflowers would bloom, something unprecedented occurred. As Theo stood beside the freshly turned earth, speaking words of farewell and gratitude, movement at the forest periphery caught the mourner's attention. There, just within the tree line, stood Lumi and her two siblings, their massive forms unmistakable even at a distance. They made no sound and no move to approach, but their presence, visible to the entire gathered village, was a clear acknowledgement. The forest, too, was saying farewell to Elder Thora. A murmur of awe passed through the mourners. Many had heard the stories of Theo's connection with the bears, but few had witnessed such clear evidence. As the burial concluded and villagers began to disperse, one young mother approached Theo, her small daughter clinging to her skirts. "Is it true?" she asked hesitantly. "Do they understand what has happened here today?" Theo looked toward the bears, who still maintained their solemn vigil at the forest edge. "They understand loss," he said gently, "and they understand respect. Those are languages that cross all boundaries." The woman nodded, something like wonder in her eyes. "My daughter has been afraid of the forest since she heard stories of wolves last winter. But seeing this," she glanced down at the child who was now looking at the bears with curiosity rather than fear. "Perhaps there are better stories we should be telling our children. The truest ones," Theo agreed. "Of caution balanced with wonder, of respect rather than fear." As spring unfurled its green promise across the land, Theo took up full residence in Elder Thora's cottage, continuing her work as healer and forest guide. But he also embarked on something new, regular gatherings where children and adults alike would come to hear not just the story of the mother bear and the lost baby, but many stories of the interconnected lives of forest and village. These gatherings, initially held in the village square, eventually moved to a special place, a small clearing within sight of the first standing stone marker of the sacred boundary. There, seated on logs arranged in a circle, villagers could glimpse the forest's edge while remaining in safe territory. Sometimes, if they were especially quiet and patient, they might catch sight of a white-patched bear watching from the shadows, her intelligent eyes reflecting the same firelight that illuminated the human gathering. "This is how we keep the covenant," Theo would explain to newcomers. "Not just by respecting boundaries, but by understanding why they exist and what wisdom flows across them." As Theo's 22nd year came to its close, he began to hear rumors of strange happenings in distant parts of the region, tales of unusual animal behavior, of wolves leading lost children to safety, of ravens guiding hunters to those injured in the wilderness. At first, he dismissed these as exaggerations inspired by Elderbrook's famous bear story. But as more reports reached him, brought by traders and travelers who sought him out specifically, Theo began to wonder. Had what happened between him and Ursa been not just a singular miracle, but the beginning of something larger? Was the ancient harmony between human and wilderness, long fractured by fear and misunderstanding, beginning to heal in places beyond their small corner of the world? On a midsummer night, unable to sleep with these questions circling in his mind, Theo made his way to the ancient oak beneath a full moon that bathed the forest in silver light. Ursa's grave, now covered with a carpet of woodland flowers, had become a place where he often sought guidance in moments of uncertainty. As he approached the massive tree, he saw Lumi already there, her white chest patch gleaming in the moonlight as she sat beside her mother's resting place. She acknowledged his arrival with a soft huff, but made no move to leave. "Something is changing in the world," Theo said aloud, settling cross-legged on the ground near the bear. "I feel it, but I don't fully understand it. I wish Elder Thora were here to explain." He smiled ruefully, though she would probably tell me to find my own answers in the forest's wisdom. Lumi made that rumbling sound so reminiscent of her mother, a sound that seemed to vibrate with meaning just beyond human comprehension. Then, with deliberate movement, she rose and walked several paces away from the grave, looking back at Theo expectantly. "You want me to follow you?" he asked, rising to his feet. The bear huffed again and continued walking, pausing occasionally to ensure he kept pace. Theo followed, curiosity overcoming caution. Though he trusted Lumi implicitly, he had never before followed her away from the familiar territory of the ancient oak at night. They traveled for nearly an hour, moving deeper into the forest than Theo typically ventured. The trees grew older here, more massive, their trunks twisted into shapes that spoke of centuries of growth. The forest floor was carpeted with luminescent fungi that cast a faint, otherworldly glow, creating a path that seemed to lead them onward. Finally, they reached a small clearing surrounded by 7 ancient trees that formed a perfect circle around a pool of water, so still it mirrored the stars above with crystalline clarity. Theo had never seen this place before, though he had explored the forest extensively since childhood. Lumi stopped at the edge of the pool and looked at Theo, then at the water, then back at him, a clear indication that they had reached their destination. With a sense of standing on the threshold of something profound, Theo knelt beside the pool. Its surface reflected his face, illuminated by moonlight, but also something more. As he gazed into the depths, the water seemed to shift and change, showing him images that could not possibly be reflected from above. A wolf leading a child through snowy mountains, an eagle guiding a lost ship to shore, a deer standing guard over a sleeping hunter. Scenes from the stories he had heard, but also others, from distant lands and times perhaps yet to come. And through them all ran a common thread, the ancient bond between human and animal worlds, damaged but never fully broken, now strengthening once more. As the final image faded, a circle of standing stones much like those being erected around Ursa's territory, but in a distant meadow he did not recognize, Theo understood what Lumi had brought him to see. "It wasn't just you and me," he whispered, looking up at the bear, who watched him with those intelligent eyes. "It's happening everywhere, the healing, the remembering." Lumi huffed softly as if in confirmation. When they returned to the ancient oak, the first light of dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon. Theo felt changed by what he had witnessed. No longer simply a forest healer or the boy saved by a bear, but part of something far larger and more profound than he had imagined. In the following months, he began to record everything: the original story of his rescue, Elder Thora's teachings, his experiences with Lumi and the vision pool, and the tales brought by travelers of similar events in distant places. These records, initially kept as personal journals, would eventually form the foundation of what future generations would call the Bear Scripture, a guide to rediscovering the ancient harmony between humanity and the natural world. 5 years passed, and Theo's work as both healer and keeper of the forest covenant flourished. The standing stones encircling Ursa's territory had become a well-known landmark, drawing pilgrims and curiosity seekers from across the land. Some came simply to hear the famous story, but others arrived with a deeper purpose, drawn by dreams or inexplicable feelings that something important awaited them in Elderbrook. Among these visitors was Lyra, a scholar from a coastal university hundreds of miles to the south. Unlike the typical pilgrims, she arrived with notebooks and measuring tools, her sharp gray eyes observing everything with academic precision rather than reverent wonder. She sought out Theo immediately upon her arrival, finding him in the village square, where he was treating a child's fever with herbs. "You're the bear speaker," she stated, rather than asked, watching as he gently pressed a cool, herb-infused cloth to the feverish child's forehead. "I'm Theo," he corrected mildly, not looking up from his patient. "The village healer. And the one who communicates with bears," Lyra persisted. "The one who was saved as an infant by the creature now buried beneath the ancient oak." Theo finished his treatment, ensuring the child was comfortable before rising to face the newcomer. Something in her tone, not disrespectful but clinically detached, stirred a protective instinct in him. Her name was Ursa, he said quietly, and she was not a creature but a being with wisdom and compassion that matched any human's. Lyra had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Forgive my academic detachment," she said, offering her hand in greeting. "I've traveled far to document what's happening here, and in other places where the old boundaries seem to be thinning." This caught Theo's attention. "You've heard of other instances, beyond the rumors?" "More than heard," Lyra confirmed. "I've documented 17 cases across 3 kingdoms in the past decade. A pod of dolphins that guided a sinking ship to shore, wolves that adopt human children, ravens that lead travelers away from avalanche paths before the snow falls." She paused, studying his reaction. "But all mere echoes of what began here, with you and the bear named Ursa." Theo invited her to continue their conversation at Elder Thora's cottage, his home now, though he still thought of it as belonging to his mentor. There, over tea brewed from forest herbs, Lyra shared her research in greater detail, spreading maps and journals across the simple wooden table. Something is changing in the relationship between humans and the wild, she explained, her initial clinical tone warming with genuine excitement. For centuries, our kind has pushed nature back, drawn hard lines between civilization and wilderness. But now, in specific places around the world, those lines are blurring again. The healing, Theo murmured, remembering what he had seen in the vision pool Lumi had shown him. Lyra looked up sharply. Yes, exactly. A healing of the ancient divide. She leaned forward, gray eyes intense. But why now? Why is this happening in our lifetime? That's what I've come to discover. Before Theo could respond, a shadow darkened the cottage doorway. Rowan stood there, his hunter's face grave with concern. Theo, you're needed at the northern boundary, he said without preamble. Strangers have crossed into our forest, armed men with cages and traps. They're heading toward the sacred territory. All thoughts of academic discussion vanished as Theo quickly gathered his staff and medicine pouch, the latter out of ingrained habit rather than any expectation of its need. How many? He asked, following Rowan outside. At least 10, the hunter replied grimly. They rebuffed our boundary patrol's warning, said they have a royal commission to capture the legendary bears of Elderbrook for some nobleman's menagerie. A cold fury settled in Theo's chest, a feeling so foreign to his usually calm nature that it momentarily startled him. No one takes the bears, he said, his voice low but carrying an authority that made both Rowan and Lyra, who had followed them outside, straighten with attention. No one violates the covenant. While Rowan gathered a larger group of hunters to intercept the intruders, Theo took a different path, heading directly for the ancient oak by the fastest route only he knew. He needed to warn Lumi and her siblings, to ensure they retreated deeper into the forest beyond even Elderbrook's boundaries if necessary. To his surprise, Lyra jogged to keep pace with him. I'm coming with you, she said firmly when he gave her a questioning look. This could be dangerous, he warned, ducking beneath a low-hanging branch without slowing his pace. All important discoveries involve risk, she replied simply. They reached the standing stones that mark the sacred boundary in record time. Theo moving through the forest with the surety of one who knew every root and hollow. But as they passed the first stone marker, its bear paw carving gleaming in the afternoon sunlight, Theo abruptly halted, raising a hand for silence. The forest had gone quiet, not with the respectful hush that often surrounded the ancient oak, but with the tense silence of threat and fear. Birds had ceased their songs and even the insects had fallen still. More telling than anything, Theo could feel an absence. Lumi and her siblings were no longer near the oak. They've already been here, he whispered, dread tightening his chest. Moving more cautiously now, they approached the ancient oak. Signs of disturbance immediately became evident. Broken branches, disturbed earth, and most alarmingly a dark stain on the forest floor that Theo recognized instantly as blood. They've wounded one of them, he said, kneeling to touch the stained earth. The blood was fresh, still tacky to the touch. Recently. Lyra stood a few paces away, her academic detachment completely gone as she surveyed the signs of violence in this sacred place. Which direction did they go? She asked, her voice hushed with horror and anger that matched Theo's own. He studied the trampled undergrowth, reading the forest floor as easily as others might read a book. Northwest, he determined, pointing toward a faint game trail. They're trying to reach the northern road where they probably have wagons waiting. A decision crystallized in his mind, clear and absolute. I'm going after them, he said, rising to his feet. Alone. That's madness, Lyra protested. You said yourself there are at least 10 armed men. I won't be alone, Theo corrected, a strange calm settling over him as he placed his palm against the ancient oak's massive trunk. Not in this forest. Before Lyra could argue further, a familiar huffing sound came from behind them. They turned to see not Lumi but her brother, the smallest of Ursa's 3 cubs, whom Theo had named Ash for his unusually dark fur. The bear's right flank bore a long, shallow cut that still seeped blood, but he stood steadily, his eyes fixed on Theo with urgent communication. You escaped them, Theo said, approaching the bear slowly. But they have Lumi and your sister. Ash huffed again, moving a few paces along the northwest trail before looking back expectantly. He wants us to follow, Theo translated for Lyra, whose expression wavered between academic fascination and open disbelief at witnessing the communication between man and bear. How badly is he injured? She asked, practical concern overriding her amazement. Theo examined the wound more closely, relief flooding him as he determined it was painful, but not life-threatening. He can travel. The blood makes it look worse than it is. Then let's go, Lyra said with unexpected resolution, adjusting her satchel more securely across her body. Your village hunters will be coming from the north to intercept these men. If we follow from behind, we can trap them between us. Theo looked at her with new appreciation. You're not what I expected from a university scholar. A wry smile touched her lips. Academia has its own kind of wilderness. You learn to adapt or perish. With Ash leading the way, they moved swiftly through the forest, following the clear trail left by men dragging heavy cages and bearing little concern for stealth. The bear set a punishing pace despite his injury, driven by urgency to rescue his sisters. As they traveled, Theo noticed something extraordinary happening around them. The forest, initially silent with fear, began to stir with purpose. Ravens appeared overhead, circling and calling before flying ahead in the direction of the intruders. A fox crossed their path, pausing to look directly at Theo before melting into the undergrowth in the same direction. Even the trees seemed to bend slightly inward, creating a more direct path for their pursuit. The forest is helping us, Lyra observed in a hushed voice, her scholar's skepticism momentarily overwhelmed by the evidence before her eyes. The covenant works both ways, Theo replied simply. We've protected this land for generations. Now it responds in kind. After nearly an hour of steady travel, Ash suddenly halted, his massive head lowering as he scented the air. A low growl rumbled in his chest, not directed at his companions but at something ahead. Theo motioned for silence, and they crept forward until they could see through a screen of evergreen branches to a small clearing beyond. The scene confirmed their worst fears. 2 large iron cages had been placed in the center of the clearing, each containing one of Ursa's daughters. Lumi paced restlessly in the larger cage, her white chest patch now stained with dirt and blood from what appeared to be a wound on her shoulder. Her sister Luna lay more still in the second cage, possibly sedated or more seriously injured. Around the cages, 8 men moved with the efficiency of experienced animal trappers, securing bindings and preparing for transport. Their leader, a tall figure in expensive leather armor, consulted a map while issuing orders to the others. 2 heavy wagons waited at the edge of the clearing, already hitched to nervous horses that clearly disliked the scent of bear. We should wait for Rowan and the others, Lyra whispered, counting the armed men. There are too many. But Theo's attention had fixed on something else, the ground beneath the cages. The leader had chosen to make camp directly atop the roots of several ancient trees, their massive surface roots forming a natural platform for the clearing. And those roots, barely perceptible to anyone not attuned to the forest's subtle movements, were beginning to shift. "We won't need to fight them," Theo murmured, placing his hand on Ash's broad head to keep the bear from charging forward in rage at seeing his sister's captive. "Watch." As they observed from hiding, the forest began to act with subtle but unmistakable purpose. The roots beneath the cages gradually twisted, causing the heavy iron structures to tilt and slide. At first, the men didn't notice, busy with their preparations. But when one cage suddenly lurched several inches to the side, the leader shouted in alarm. "Secure those cages," he ordered. "The ground's unstable." His men hurried to comply, but nature had only begun its response. A massive branch from overhead suddenly cracked and fell, missing the cages but smashing across one wagon, splintering its axle. The horses reared in panic, breaking free of their tethers and bolting into the forest. Confusion erupted in the clearing as the men scrambled to control the situation. In that moment of chaos, Theo stepped from concealment, Ash at his side. The sight of a man walking calmly forward with a massive bear beside him brought an instant of stunned silence to the clearing. "You have violated sacred ground," Theo called, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to reverberate through the surrounding trees. "You have shed blood in a protected sanctuary and attempted to steal those under Elderbrook's guardianship." The leader recovered his composure quickly, drawing a crossbow from his back. "Stand aside, forest rat," he sneered. "These beasts are bound for Duke Karsten's menagerie, by royal decree. Interfere, and you'll join them in chains." But Theo continued his advance, seeming to grow taller with each step. The air around him shimmered slightly as if heat rose from his skin despite the cool forest air. Beside him, Ash growled, but made no move to attack, matching his pace precisely to Theo's deliberate steps. "I am Theo of Elderbrook," he announced, his voice deepening with a resonance that carried beyond the clearing. "Guardian of the Covenant, speaker to the bears, child of Ursa the Compassionate, and I say you will release her daughters and leave these woods forever." The leader raised his crossbow, aiming directly at Theo's heart. "Fine words for a dead man," he said coldly, and pulled the trigger. What happened next would be told and retold, with increasing embellishment, throughout Elderbrook and far beyond for generations to come. The crossbow bolt, flying true toward Theo's unprotected chest, suddenly veered in mid-flight, as if caught by an impossible gust of wind in the still forest air, and embedded itself harmlessly in the earth. Before the stunned leader could reload, the very ground beneath the cages heaved upward, toppling both iron structures. The locks, stressed beyond their capacity by the impact, broke open. Lumi and Luna, freed from their prisons, rose with matching roars of fury that shook leaves from the surrounding trees. In that moment, from the north came answering calls, human voices, and the blast of hunting horns as Rowan and the village hunters arrived at the edge of the clearing, arrows nocked and ready. The trappers found themselves surrounded by armed villagers, by 3 enraged bears, and most unnervingly by a forest that seemed to have awakened into hostile awareness around them. Trees creaked ominously. Roots writhed across the ground like serpents, and from every direction came the sounds of animals gathering, wolves, foxes, even the distinctive snorts of wild boar. Their leader, face pale with a fear he could no longer conceal, slowly lowered his crossbow. "What manner of witchcraft is this?" he demanded, his voice unsteady. "Not witchcraft," Theo corrected calmly. "Covenant, the ancient promise between human and wild that your kind has forgotten." He stepped forward, stopping just beyond arm's reach of the man. "You came with cages and weapons. thinking to take something precious from this forest. Instead, you will leave with knowledge and a warning." He gestured to the trapper's remaining wagon. "Take your men and go. Tell Duke Karsten that the bears of Elderbrook are not for his menagerie. Tell him that boundaries exist not just on maps, but in the very fabric of the world, and some should never be crossed." For a tense moment it seemed the leader might refuse, might order his men to fight despite being outnumbered and surrounded. But wisdom finally overcame pride, and he signaled for his men to withdraw. "This isn't finished," he warned as they backed toward their damaged wagon. "The Duke doesn't accept defiance from peasant villages." "Then he will learn a new lesson," Theo replied evenly, "as you have today." Under the watchful eyes of villagers, bears, and forest alike, the trappers retreated, forced to leave behind their broken wagon and cages. When they had vanished up the northern road, a collective exhalation seemed to pass through the clearing, trees settling, animals dispersing, the unnatural tension in the air gradually dissipating. Rowan approached Theo, his expression a mix of relief and awe. "When we heard the bears roar, we feared we were too late," he said, gripping Theo's shoulder. "But it seems you had matters well in hand." He glanced meaningfully at the forest around them, which had so visibly participated in the confrontation. Theo shook his head. "Not I," he corrected. "The Covenant itself responded." He turned to where Lumi, Luna, and Ash had gathered at the clearing's edge, their massive forms silhouetted against the deepening afternoon shadows. "They are not possessions to be caged, but guardians of wisdom we have barely begun to remember." Lyra, who had observed everything from the forest edge, finally stepped forward. Her scholar's notebook was clutched in one hand, but remained closed. Some experiences, she had realized, could not and should not be reduced to academic notations. "What happened here today," she said softly, "was what I've been seeking to understand all along. Not just cooperation between species, but something deeper, a remembering of what was once known by all." Theo nodded, suddenly weary from the intensity of what had transpired. "Elder Thora once told me that the greatest wisdom is not found in new discoveries, but in remembering what has been forgotten." As the villagers began the journey home, Lumi approached Theo, her injured shoulder already tended by one of the village healers who had accompanied the hunting party. The white-patched bear huffed softly, nudging his hand with her massive muzzle in a gesture of connection that needed no translation for anyone present. That evening, a celebration filled Elderbrook's village square, not just of victory over the Duke's trappers, but of something more profound, the visible manifestation of the covenant that had sustained their community through generations. Music and dancing continued late into the night, with Theo at the center of much attention and retelling of the day's events. But as the stars reached their zenith, he slipped away from the festivities, making his way alone to the ancient oak. There, by Ursa's grave, now illuminated by moonlight, he found Lumi waiting for him, as if she had known he would come. "Your mother would be proud," he said softly, settling beside the bear on the cool earth. Her compassion that day set all of this in motion, this healing, this remembering. Lumi made a gentle rumbling sound, her intelligent eyes reflecting starlight as she gazed at him. And in that moment, with perfect clarity, Theo understood what his life's work would truly be. Not just healing physical ailments or protecting a single sanctuary, but helping to restore the ancient wisdom that connected human and wild, the knowledge that boundaries existed not to separate, but to define the sacred meeting places where different worlds could touch in mutual respect. As if confirming his thoughts, Lumi rose and padded to the ancient oak, raising herself on hind legs to place her massive paws against its trunk, a gesture Theo had never seen her make before. The white patch on her chest seemed to glow in the moonlight as she looked back at him, then at the stars, then at the forest that spread in all directions around them. Understanding her invitation, Theo placed his hands on the oak's rough bark beside her paws. Immediately, a sensation flooded through him, not words or images exactly, but a knowing deeper than either. He felt, knew the web of life that connected all things, the flowing wisdom that moved between root and branch, paw and hand, heart and mind. This was the true covenant. Not just between Elderbrook and its bears, but between humanity and the living world. A promise as old as the first human who looked into animal eyes and recognized a kindred spirit there. A wisdom fractured but never fully lost, now stirring again like sap rising after a long winter. And as the moon traced its arc across the star-strewn sky, bear and man remained in communion with ancient tree and timeless knowledge, two species joined in remembrance of what had always been true. That compassion knows no boundaries, that wisdom flows through all living things, and that sometimes the greatest miracles begin with the simplest acts of kindness, like a mother bear who once found a lost baby in the forest and chose to protect rather than harm. 20 years passed, and the world beyond Elderbrook's forests changed dramatically. Kingdoms rose and fell. Boundaries shifted on maps drawn in distant cities, and new technologies began to transform how humans lived and worked. But through it all, the small village nestled at the edge of the ancient forest maintained its covenant, passing the story of Ursa and Theo from generation to generation with unwavering devotion. Theo himself had changed with the passing years. Now in his 40s, silver threaded his dark hair, and lines of experience mapped his face. Yet his eyes remained the same, clear, thoughtful, and still holding that unusual connection to the wilderness that had defined his life since infancy. He had never married, though not for lack of opportunity. Lyra, the scholar from the coastal university, had remained in Elderbrook for many years, documenting the covenant and eventually becoming Theo's closest companion and intellectual partner before returning to the university to establish the first formal academy of interspecies communication. Their collaborative work, the Elderbrook Covenant, restoring ancient harmony between human and wild, had spread far beyond the region, inspiring similar sanctuaries in forests, mountains, and coastal areas across the known world. What had begun as a single miraculous encounter between a mother bear and a lost human child had blossomed into a movement, small but growing, of remembering and restoring the ancient connections. On a crisp autumn morning, much like the one when Ursa had first found infant Theo in the forest, a small procession made its way toward the ancient oak. Leading the way was Theo himself, his staff of office, carved from oak and inlaid with bear tracks in silver, marking his status as both village healer and guardian of the covenant. Behind him walked Aaliyah, Rowan's granddaughter, and Theo's chosen apprentice, her serious young face alight with the solemnity of the occasion. Following them came nearly every villager from Elderbrook, all dressed in their finest clothes, many carrying offerings of honey, berries, and freshly caught fish. Most significant of all was a stone tablet, carefully transported on a litter carried by 4 strong young hunters. On its surface, master stonecutters had carved the complete story of Ursa and the covenant that grew from her compassion, surrounded by images of bears, humans, and the ancient oak, all intertwined in a continuous border that had no beginning or end. The procession passed through the circle of standing stones that had marked the sacred boundary for over 20 years. Those original markers had been joined by others over time, carved wooden posts, living trees specially planted and trained to grow in perfect alignment, and at each cardinal direction, small shrines where travelers could leave offerings and learn the covenant's story from inscriptions in multiple languages. As they approached the ancient oak, now even more massive than in Theo's youth, its branches spreading like protective arms over Ursa's flower-covered grave, they found the clearing already occupied. Lumi, her white chest patch now tinged with gray that matched Theo's silver-streaked hair, sat in solemn dignity beside the grave. Around her gathered her own grown cubs and their cubs, 3 generations of bears descended from Ursa, all seemingly aware of the significance of this gathering. Most remarkable to the younger villagers who had never witnessed such a sight was the complete absence of fear on either side. The bears watched the human procession with intelligent curiosity rather than aggression or alarm, while the villagers approached with reverence instead of terror. When all had assembled in the clearing, Theo stepped forward, raising his staff for silence. The autumn sunlight filtering through the oak's golden leaves cast dappled patterns across his face as he spoke. 25 years ago, Elder Thora led us to this place to honor the bear who saved a human child when she had every reason to harm it, he began, his deep voice carrying clearly through the hushed assembly. Today, we return to mark that covenant not just in memory and tradition, but in stone that will endure for generations after we are gone. He gestured, and the bearers carefully placed the carved tablet at the base of the ancient oak, positioned so that morning sunlight would illuminate its surface. The assembled villagers murmured approval at the sight of their shared story made permanent in stone. The tablet will remain here as testament, Theo continued. But the true covenant lives not in stone, but in hearts and actions. For 25 years, no hunter from Elderbrook has raised a weapon against the bears of this forest. For 25 years, no bear has harmed a human who respected the boundary markers. What began as miracle has become mutual trust, the first threads of an ancient tapestry being rewoven. He turned to face Lumi, addressing her directly as he had countless times over their shared decades. Your mother's compassion changed not just one life, but many. It awakened something long dormant in human hearts. The memory that we were not always separate from the wild, that wisdom flows in all living blood. As if understanding his words, and perhaps she did, in her own way, Lumi rose and approached the stone tablet. The assembled villagers held their collective breath, not in fear, but in anticipation of something momentous. With deliberate grace, the aging bear placed one massive paw on the carved surface, directly over the image of her mother cradling infant Theo. A murmur of awe passed through the gathering. Even Theo, accustomed to the bear's uncanny awareness, felt his heart swell with emotion at this gesture of acknowledgement. It was as if Lumi were adding her own signature to the covenant, confirming it from the wild side of the boundary. What happened next, however, exceeded even his expectations. Lumi turned from the tablet and approached Theo directly. Though they had shared countless moments of connection over the years, she had never before initiated contact in such a public setting. With gentle deliberation, she rose briefly on her hind legs, a position bears rarely take except in threat or extreme curiosity, and lightly touched her nose to Theo's forehead, exactly as her mother had done years ago after he freed her from the poacher's trap. The clearing fell absolutely silent. Even the forest birds seemed to pause their songs in recognition of the moment's significance. Then, with equal deliberation, Lumi turned to Aaliyah, Theo's young apprentice, and repeated the gesture. A blessing, a passing of connection, a continuation of the covenant into the next generation. Tears flowed freely down Theo's face as he understood the full meaning of what Lumi had done. She was acknowledging not just the past but the future, recognizing that both she and Theo were growing older, that the covenant would soon pass to new guardians on both sides of the boundary. After the ceremony concluded and the villagers began their return journey, Theo remained behind with Aaliyah, standing before the newly placed tablet as afternoon shadows lengthened across the clearing. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," he admitted to his apprentice. "When I was your age, I believed I was alone in remembering the old connections, that perhaps only Elderbrook would ever restore the covenant between human and wild." Aaliyah, a thoughtful young woman of 17 with keen eyes that missed little, nodded in understanding. "But now similar sanctuaries exist in 12 kingdoms," she said. "The seeds you planted have taken root far beyond our forest." "Not my seeds," Theo corrected gently. "Ursa's. I was merely the soil in which they grew." He touched the carved image of the mother bear on the stone tablet. "All great changes begin simply, with one choice, one moment of seeing beyond boundaries." As twilight deepened the forest shadows, they made their way back toward the village. Behind them, Lumi and her family retreated to their dens for the coming night, the ancient rhythms of the forest continuing as they had for countless generations before humans ever walked beneath these trees. Yet something had shifted, had been shifting gradually for 25 years since a mother bear found a lost baby in the forest. The rigid boundary between human and wild, a division that had hardened over centuries of fear and misunderstanding, had begun to soften again, allowing wisdom to flow once more between worlds too long separated. In the decades that followed, Theo's hair would turn fully white, and Lumi would eventually join her mother beneath the ancient oak, their graves side by side in recognition of their shared legacy. Aaliyah would become guardian of the covenant after Theo, training her own apprentices in turn. The bears descended from Ursa would continue to recognize the special boundary of the sanctuary, sometimes even leading injured humans to safety or guiding lost children back to forest paths. The stone tablet would weather with seasons, its carving softened by rain and snow but never erased. Pilgrims would continue to visit from distant lands, some simply curious, others drawn by dreams or inexplicable knowing that something important awaited them in this forest sanctuary. And occasionally, very occasionally, a traveler would report a similar miracle in some far-off woodland or mountain range, a wild creature choosing compassion over instinct, a human responding with understanding rather than fear. Small moments, easily dismissed by skeptics, but recognized by those who remembered the covenant as signs of the ancient harmony slowly reawakening. For the greatest truth revealed by the story of the mother bear and the lost baby was not that miracles happen in moments of extraordinary circumstance, but that the capacity for connection across boundaries lies dormant in all hearts, human and animal alike, waiting only for the courage to choose compassion when fear seems the safer path. As Elder Thora had told young Theo so many years ago, the greatest wisdom is not found in new discoveries, but in remembering what has been forgotten. And in the ancient forest surrounding Elderbrook village, in the covenant between its people and the bears of the western ridge, in the story carved in stone beneath the ancient oak, that remembering continued. A small light rekindled after long darkness, a first step on the long journey home to harmony between human and wild. Epilogue. Centuries later, long after Elderbrook had grown from village to town to small city, the ancient oak still stood, now at the center of what had become known as Covenant Park. The original stone tablet had been joined by others, creating a circular pattern around Ursa's grave, each telling another chapter in the continuing story of harmony between humans and the wild. The forest still thrived, protected not just by local tradition but by royal decree and international treaty, recognized as the birthplace of the global covenant of interspecies cooperation that now guided human interaction with the natural world across continents. On a spring morning, much like the one when this story began, a young ranger named Theo, named after the original bridge walker between worlds, led a group of schoolchildren along carefully maintained paths to the ancient oak. The children, representing schools from a dozen different countries, listened with wide-eyed wonder as he recounted the story that had begun it all. And so, he concluded, gesturing to the magnificent oak that had witnessed so much history, from one simple act of compassion, a mother bear choosing to protect rather than harm a human child, grew a movement that changed how we understand our place in the natural world. A small girl with bright, curious eyes raised her hand. "But Ranger Theo," she asked with the directness of children everywhere, "do you really believe a bear adopted a human baby? Couldn't it just be a story someone made up?" The young ranger smiled, not offended by the question. "Come with me," he said, leading the children to a small building near the oak, the Covenant Museum that housed artifacts and records from centuries of human-bear interaction in the sanctuary. Inside, in a place of honor, sat a glass case containing the oldest and most precious relic of all, a faded blue blanket with tiny embroidered stars, preserved across the centuries. Beside it lay a bear claw pendant on a cord of woven grass, and a journal written in a careful hand, its opening words still legible despite the yellowing pages. "I, Theo of Elderbrook, once a lost baby in these woods, set down this true account of how a mother bear named Ursa found me and chose compassion over instinct, beginning a covenant that healed ancient divisions." The children gathered around, suddenly quiet as the reality of the story sank in. This was no mere legend, but history, documented, preserved, and continued in the living sanctuary around them. As they left the museum to continue their tour, the same curious child tugged at Ranger Theo's sleeve. "Do the bears still come to the ancient oak?" she whispered. He smiled, kneeling to meet her eyes. "They do," he confirmed. The descendants of Ursa and Lumi still recognize this as sacred ground. "In fact," he added, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "if you're very quiet and very patient, you might catch a glimpse of them at dusk. They often come to visit the graves of their ancestors." Later that evening, after the tour groups had departed and shadows lengthened across Covenant Park, the young ranger returned alone to the ancient oak. As twilight softened the forest edges, he sat quietly on a bench placed for contemplation, watching and waiting with practiced patience. Right on schedule, just as the first stars appeared overhead, movement at the forest edge caught his attention. A large bear, not as massive as the grizzlies of northern mountains but impressive nonetheless, emerged cautiously into the clearing. Most distinctive was the patch of white fur on her chest, a genetic trait passed down through countless generations from Lumi herself. The bear paused, testing the air with her sensitive nose, her intelligent eyes scanning the clearing until they found the waiting ranger. There was no fear in her posture, just cautious assessment followed by what appeared to be recognition. Ranger Theo remained perfectly still, offering the respect of non-interference that formed the foundation of the covenant. He was there merely to witness, not to interact, though over his years of service, he had occasionally experienced moments of connection with the sanctuary bears that defied scientific explanation. The bear approached the circle of stone tablets, moving with deliberate dignity to the oldest one at the ancient oak's base. There, she performed the ritual that her mother and grandmothers had performed for centuries before her, placing one paw briefly on the carved image of Ursa and the human infant, a gesture of remembrance and continuation. Then she settled on the earth between the graves of Ursa and Lumi, as comfortable as if sitting in her own den. For nearly an hour, bear and human shared the sacred space in peaceful coexistence, separate yet connected by the invisible threads of a covenant begun centuries ago but renewed with each generation. As full darkness descended and the bear finally rose to return to the forest depths, she paused at the edge of the clearing. For just a moment, her gaze met the ranger's across the distance, not with the blank stare of a wild animal, but with the knowing look of one conscious being acknowledging another. In that silent exchange lived the enduring miracle that had started with a lost baby and a mother bear in this very forest. The recognition that the greatest boundaries exist not between species but between hearts closed and hearts opened by compassion. The bear disappeared into the shadows, returning to her wild domain as her ancestors had done for centuries. Ranger Theo remained a moment longer, offering silent gratitude for being part of this continuing story, this testimony to the enduring truth that once, long ago and still today, a mother bear adopted a lost baby in the forest, and something miraculous happened. The End's teachings, his experiences with Lumi and the Vision Pool, and the tales brought by travelers of similar events in distant places. These records, initially kept as personal journals, would eventually form the foundation of what future generations would call the Bear Scripture, a guide to rediscovering the ancient harmony between humanity and the natural world.